Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this ASIFMA virtual event on evolving cyber landscape in light of COVID-19, managing the impact. We're delighted to have you with us today. We have over 120 participants at the moment, and the number increasing every second. So it's great to have so many of you with us today, certainly in light of the Typhoon 8 that's being hosted in Hong Kong today. Before we start, I'd very much like to thank all our endorsers of this event, the Association of Banks in Singapore, the Asia Cloud Computing Association, FS-ISEC, the FinTech Association of Hong Kong, the Hong Kong Financial Services Business Continuity Management Forum, and the Hong Kong Association of Banks. Thanks very much all for your tremendous support. So perhaps briefly, before we start, I'd like to take you through the agenda of the session today. So we will start with a 20-minute keynote of Jiao-Seng Tang. We're very honored to have him with us today. Jiao-Seng is the Executive Director of Technology, Risk and Payments in the department and Chief Cybersecurity Officer at the MAS, the Monetary Authority of Singapore. Jiao-Seng will then join a panel discussion, and also joining us will be Ray Irving at FS-ISEC and David Leash at JP Morgan, who I will introduce to you later on. We will have plenty of time for Q&A as well throughout the session, as well as at the end of the session. So perhaps briefly, a couple of areas that we would like to cover today. Obviously, COVID-19 has had a huge impact on organizations, the way employees work, etc., and it has spearheaded digitization. So against that backdrop, there's a couple of topics we wanted to discuss with you today, including how the threat landscape has changed as a result of COVID-19, how has the insider risk increased, what are some of the best practices that the panelists want to share with you, how can the financial industry address the working from home connection, what is the regulators' angle and view on all this, and then really also looking ahead, right? What will the new normal look like, and in terms of cyber, what are the priorities for the future beyond COVID-19? So as I said, we are in a webinar setting of Zoom, so you're all on mute, but please do share your questions by clicking on the Q&A box on your toolbar at the bottom of your screen. At all times during the session, I'll try to weave them in and throw them at the panelists who will be delighted to respond these questions for you. We'll also have 2 live polling questions throughout the session. When they appear on screen, then you will also see a poll box popping up throughout the session. So please participate. We like to hear from you and keep you engaged throughout the session as well. So now, without further ado, let's welcome Mr. Jiao-Seng Tang, Executive Director at the MAS, who will deliver his keynote on cyber resilience in the financial sector, emerging stronger from COVID-19. So Jiao-Seng, over to you, please. Jiao-Seng, you're still on mute. Just have to unmute yourself.
Right.
Perfect.
Okay. Can you hear me? Okay,
Perfect.
Great. Thanks. A very good morning to everyone tuning in from Asia, and good afternoon and evening for the rest watching from the other parts of the world. Since the dawn of COVID-19, in the beginning of this year, we have experienced profound changes in our lives. Singapore's financial sector has seen its share of challenges and lessons learned. I will touch on the operational and cyber risks brought about by COVID in the financial sector. If there's one thing that the pandemic has taught us, it is the sharing of our collective experience on how to manage the COVID-related risks that will enable us to emerge from this crisis stronger and more resilient. Singapore saw its first cases of COVID-19 infection in late January, and a multi-ministerial task force was set up to coordinate the pandemic response. the number of cases continued to rise in early April, and Singapore implemented movement restrictions to curb community transmission. We call this circuit breaker in Singapore. During the circuit breaker, only essential service providers such as food, telecommunications, and financial services could have staff who needed physical access to critical systems or resources to work on site. The circuit breaker, which lasted about 2 months, proved to be effective, and it helped us get the community cases under control. The circuit breaker was lifted in June and was followed by a phased reopening of more economic and social activities. We are now looking at further easing of social distancing measures and resuming gatherings and events in larger groups, subject to safe management measures such as wearing of masks and safe distance of 1 meter between individuals. That said, Singapore remains cautious of possible resurgence. We are ready to retighten the social distancing measures to stem any new waves of infection. As swift contact tracing is key in nipping community spread in the bud, Singapore implemented a national digital visitor management system known as Safe Entry, where visitors to all buildings and establishments are required to digitally check in and out via a Safe Entry mobile app or national identity card. Apart from supporting the national safe management initiatives to ensure that our financial sector comply with the pandemic management requirements, MAS is focused on building cyber resilience in the financial sector in light of the accentuated cyber risks brought about by COVID. I would like to delve deeper into the topic of cybersecurity and how the financial sector can remain cyber safe during the post-COVID. Naturally, there will be some crystal ball gazing, as there is still much to learn about COVID and our working paradigm is still evolving. I will frame this discussion with 3 questions. What has changed during COVID? What will the new normal look like post-COVID? What this means for the financial sector from the regulatory perspective. COVID has caused a number of notable shifts in the financial sector that have a bearing on cybersecurity. We have witnessed the hastening of digitalization in FIs, and customers are much more receptive to using online financial services. At the same time, remote working is no longer a good to have, but a must have for many. Our ability to gain physical access to IT systems and equipment has also diminished. And lastly, we find ourselves in a prolonged crisis with no clear end in sight. In announcing Microsoft's quarterly earnings this year, CEO Satya Nadella commented that the company saw 2 years' worth of digital transformation in 2 months. MAS has also observed similar trends in our financial sector, especially in adoption of digital financial services. E-payment adoption rates, for example, have increased substantially during this period. Between April and August this year, Singapore's nationwide mobile e-payment platform for retail fund transfers, known as PayNow, saw close to 600,000 new individual registrations. PayNow transactions growth between May to July this year was 5 to 6 times higher as compared to during pre-COVID. On the positive side, COVID has spurred FIs stretching the use of technology to ensure that customers continue to have access to financial services. Customers have also readily embraced online financial services. In addition, FIs also have tried to overcome the adversity by re-engineering and automating manual processes so that work can be performed remotely or with less human intervention. So remote working has allowed many workers to stay connected amidst movement restrictions and social distancing measures across the world. In Singapore, we avoid using the term social distancing, as modern technology has enabled us to maintain a safe distance while we remain socially connected. Many work teams now can connect remotely to access their corporate systems and applications to perform their tasks. Consequently, the security of devices that are used for remote access have to take into account the extensive use of residential and public broadband networks, which are often not as resilient and secure as corporate leased lines and infrastructure in office. Overnight, our home routers and broadband equipment that we use to watch our cable TV become a conduit that enable us to initiate multi-million-dollar transactions. Unlike most commercial-grade network infrastructure, the home network could harbor security weaknesses that can be more easily exploited by cyber criminals. We also saw some FIs having to relax security controls that were designed for on-site operations to enable remote working. Limited physical access to the office often means that certain sensitive or critical operations that can only be carried out on-site have to be postponed or dispensed with. For example, where physical access is required to invoke security appliances, to generate cryptographic keys to encrypt sensitive customer data, FIs may have no choice but to postpone such operations due to restricted physical access, and hence reducing the security of encryption solution. We're now faced with a pandemic crisis that has no visible end in sight. Most of our current business continuity planning have neither factored in such an extensive scale-up of remote working, nor have they considered that contingency arrangements could pan out for such a prolonged period. Patching via limited home network broadband can be tricky. When the COVID movement restrictions set in, IT teams may have postponed system upgrades and security patching, anticipating that remote working in split teams will be temporal, and staff will soon be back on site where the devices can be patched. Ultimately, the increased use of digital platforms and technology inevitably enlarges the cyber attack surface. The cyber defense lines were stretched thin, and the boundaries have been pushed further away from the FI sphere of control. I will now touch on some of the more pronounced cyber threats resulting from the above changes. During this period, we find ourselves facing a paradox of being kept apart by safe distancing, yet drawn closer virtually together by technology. The pervasive use of video and teleconferencing platforms means that organizations must be proficient in securing a variety of platforms to prevent information breach. Cyber threats also grew against the backdrop of widespread social anxieties. For example, the heightened fear about COVID caused individuals to be more susceptible to online social engineering, such as phishing attacks that trick victims into divulging the system login credentials or click on malicious links. It is thus pertinent for FIs to understand the anatomy of cyber attackers' techniques and tactics and implement robust measures to reduce the clear and present dangers for themselves and for their customers. So what will the post-COVID new normal look like? I think in the long run, it is likely that most FIs will adopt a hybrid of on-site and remote working. FIs also have to grapple with the potential oscillation between the easing and tightening of safety measures, which in turn affects the proportion of workers in the office. Yesterday, the Straits Times newspaper published a survey on remote working, and 8 out of 10 workers indicated that they prefer to work from home or have flexible working arrangements. As many of the existing controls are primarily designed for the office environment, this means that FIs have to ensure that their controls and processes remain secure and effective when switching between remote working and working in office. Next, the integration of operational technology and information technology will pick up pace. We should not overlook the risk posed by this development. There have been early initiatives to make OT equipment more intelligent to better support safe management needs. Organizations such as are starting to consider enhancing their elevator systems, air ventilation control equipment, door access systems to interface with corporate IT systems to facilitate analysis of data for contact tracing and real-time response. In the same vein, we are likely to see more deployment of Internet of Things for the same reasons. So we should rigorously manage the cyber risks associated with IoTs and OT, especially when such equipments are connected to the corporate network. Next, the onset of COVID saw FIs opening up some of the internal systems and applications to remote access. Firewall ports and network traffic routing rules may be modified to enable this to happen. We're likely to see more and more critical systems being able to be accessed remotely over the internet, albeit over VPN. This means that systems which used to be protected within the physical sanctuary of the FIs can potentially be accessed by cyber criminals if they are inadequately secured. So we have been asking ourselves within MAS how we should respond to these shifts. First, our technology risk supervision approach will need to evolve in tandem with the changes. The recent developments provided us the opportunity to rethink the way we approach supervision. The need for safe distancing measures means that we have to reduce our physical interactions with the FIs and be able to engage a more dispersed FI workforce in multiple locations, while continuing to maintain effective supervisory oversight on the FIs. The rapid digitalization of the FIs through our fintech push over the past 5 years means that much of the information we need for supervision can be obtained and analyzed remotely. A likely outcome is that supervision will gravitate towards using a metrics-driven approach to monitor tech and cyber risks without the need for us to go on-site. MAS has started to develop metrics-driven and continuously monitoring supervisory approach. For instance, we have started to monitor key risks and performance indicators, such as the timeliness of security patching, antivirus signatures updates, and system capacity utilization rates on IT devices to derive insights as to how well the FIs are managing their IT environment. Second, cooperation across global financial regulators as well as between regulators and FIs will have to be stepped up, as FIs, systems and networks are highly intertwined even at the global level. Between global financial regulators, there is a common understanding that cyber threats spans across borders, and our response should likewise be so. On the international front, financial regulators have also increased our focus on managing cyber risks in the financial sector. One example is the Financial Stability Board's Working Group for Cyber Incident Response and Recovery, which MAS has had the honor to chair. The CIRR group, in short, was set up to develop a toolkit of effective practices to support FIs in responding to and recovering from a cyber incident. The effective practices are categorized into 7 key areas, which encompass governance, planning and preparation, analysis, mitigation, restoration and recovery, coordination and communication, last but not least, improvement. In developing the toolkit, the CIRR has also requested the feedback on lessons learned from the COVID pandemic and related cyber activity. The working group noted that due to COVID, organizations may need to adjust the cyber risk management processes, cyber incident reporting, as well as management of critical third-party service providers. The toolkit also points out the importance of effective preparation and testing of cyber incident response and recovery plans, taking into account remote working and operations. The toolkit, which is developed for authorities and financial institutions, is in the final stages of approval and slated to be published in end October 2020. So do look out for it. MAS has also worked with FSISAC to establish the Central Bank's Regulators and Supervisory Entities Forum, in short, series, for financial regulators to share cyber threat information and knowledge. Series, which was modeled after the successful FSISAC Forum for FIs, has seen served us well by enabling effective multilateral information exchanges among regulators. Locally, between MAS and FIs in Singapore, there is also a shared understanding that cooperation is needed to reposition the financial sector for the new normal. MAS actively partners industry such as the Association of Banks in Singapore and insurance associations on cybersecurity to pursue industry-wide cyber initiatives such as development of cyber guidelines, industry pen tests, and bug bounty programs. An example of these close public-private partnership is in the area of operational resilience arising from COVID. MAS and the Association of Banks in Singapore set up the Return to On-site Operations Task Force, ROOT for short, in May this year to exchange best practices on operational resilience and pandemic safe management, and to embark on various projects for the sector, such as redesigning of FI's workspaces to create a working environment that is safe for the customers and employees, identifying industry-wide paper-based and mutual workflows for digitalization to better support remote working. To conclude, the COVID situation has grown from a supposedly mundane health issue into a multifaceted triple whammy global crisis, spanning health, financial, and social disciplines. The silver lining is that it has quickened the digitalization of financial services, as well as the adoption by individuals and companies. This also means that technology and cyber resilience have to become even more important in the financial sector. As regulators, MAS aims to be responsive to the evolving cyber threats and continue to adjust our supervision approach and toolkits to meet the changing demands. To realize this, it is crucial that the industry maintains close cooperation and strong sense of solidarity. With that, I will end my presentation today, and thank you for your attention, and I look forward to an engaging panel discussion later. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joseng, for those opening remarks, which I think set us up very, very well for the panel discussion. Thanks very much for sharing how what the MAS has been seeing in Singapore, but also on the global level. So we're now move on to our panel discussion of today. So Joseng will be joining the discussion. And in addition, we're very honored to have Ray Irving, who is Managing Director of Global Services at FSISAC. Welcome, Ray. As well as David Leash, who is Head of Cybersecurity and Tech Controls Asia Pacific at JP Morgan. David is also the co-chair of ASIFMA's Cybersecurity Working Group. Great to have you with us today. So before we kick off, I see we already have a couple of questions from the audience. We have over 250 people joining us today. So please feel free to share your questions, thoughts on the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And we'll do our very best to answer the questions that you throw at us today. But why don't we kick off with you, Ray? So at FSISAC, you have, I think you guys have a good view of how the external threat landscape has changed or hasn't in light of COVID-19. And obviously this pandemic has been going on for many, many months now. You see, what are some of the more recent trends, and do you see any changes, for example, compared to the outset of the pandemic? We'd be grateful for your thoughts there.
Sure thing. So FS Isaac functions as a sort of neighborhood watch for the financial services sector, and our members are able to share what they're seeing in cyber in terms of incidents and threats, and we can aggregate that and report on that. So we do have quite a good view on what's happening. Now, in the early stages of the pandemic, we saw particularly phishing reports were up about 1/3. And there was basically in the early stages a sort of arms race where threat actors, they weren't coming out with new attacks as such, but they were rebranding their attacks, if you like, to take advantage of COVID. So we were seeing a lot of phishing attacks that were using COVID themes as a lure, for example. So they would be related to loans or government schemes or other aspects that would be relevant to the pandemic and the fact that obviously a lot of people were facing changing circumstances. So there was, in the early stages, there was a sort of arms race as these new sites were popping up and hosting providers were taking them down again. And there was definitely a big spike. I'd say round about by July, that had probably more or less leveled off to much the same level as we had pre-pandemic, which is not to say that things are quiet, just less busy. There's certainly plenty going on at the moment. We're seeing active ransomware campaigns, denial of service campaigns, and all the other usual threats are still out there. So really, in summary, it's been business as usual in the sense that the attacks have been the same kind of attacks that we're always familiar with, and the ways to counter them have been the same. But yeah, there was a surge early on. The other threat, which is always present and is much harder to get any concrete metrics on, of course, is insider threat. And there I would say that is, given that people have moved to new working practices, people are having to adapt business processes to cope with, in many cases, distributed working. That is obviously a major change as well. And I would say that financial firms need to be cognizant that insider threats are probably worsened by the pandemic, all in all.
Great, thanks, Ray. And then perhaps from your perspective, and David, like anything you can share, perhaps specifically on the insider threat. Obviously, JP Morgan staff has been, or perhaps to a large extent still is, working from home. What has that meant for you guys? What have you been seeing?
Yeah, so look, I mean, I think for us, the insider threat probably remains the same as it was previously, largely focused on the right preventative controls, the right education and awareness for our staff. But I did want to touch on a little bit what Ray was talking about. Absolutely right, Ray. I agree with you on the real tools and techniques. Social engineering still continues to ride high. What I think I would say has been an increase, additional to what you talked about, is really the bad actors looking to exploit those remote working scenarios. And what I'm talking about here is organizations hastily establishing remote working environments where they didn't have them in the past. They may not have configured them in the right way. They may not have patched them in the right way. Now, that's not to say the threat actors weren't looking for these things in the past, but because there was more availability or so-called more vulnerability, that those were ripe for attack. And so, I think that's been a very key area of focus in addition to phishing and social engineering, has been to look at those potential vulnerabilities in remote access infrastructure. And also where organizations haven't been leveraging multi-factor authentication, password spraying attacks, etc. Again, to Ray's point, we're not talking about new techniques here so much, but taking advantage of this COVID situation to be increasing the likelihood of success because of the current conditions.
Okay, great. On that note, Flora, can you please pull up the first polling question for the audience? Great, thank you. So polling question to the audience. So the biggest cyber challenge for my firm during the pandemic has been A, ensuring safe and secure working from home environment for employees, B, continuing staff education, C, increasing number of cyber attacks, phishing emails, etc. rolling out safely and securely new digitization projects in a short period of time, disruptions at third-party suppliers. So over to the audience to respond. And then, so I think, David, while the audience is responding, David and Ray, I think you were both saying basically that there hasn't been a tremendous change in the type of attacks, right? Like the team obviously was adapted. There were no new techniques, but threats, but the bad actors were taking advantage of this new situation. But I must think that there must be some changes or some differences between this crisis and previous ones, right? Like it's a very prolonged situation, it's global, all your third-party suppliers are impacted, etc. It really impacts everybody, right? How has JP Morgan been reacting to that? And Ray, what have you seen your members and clients doing? Perhaps I'll start with you, Ray.
Well, yeah, so clearly from a resiliency point of view, this has been a huge game changer. I don't think that many contingency plans had anticipated, for example, being unable to use their buildings for weeks and weeks on end. A typical disaster plan would be expecting more that you might lose a building to fire or flood or something and a failover to a failover site. So straight away, I think a lot of firms were asking, why are we paying money for for example, failover offices when actually we can send everybody home and they can all work from there. So there's some huge changes there, and people are rethinking, I think, the way resiliency works. I mean, again, the resiliency plans needed to cover every single line of business, and I'm not sure whether everybody had that at the beginning of the pandemic. They needed to figure out how branches are going to function, because you need people in branches in order to conduct transactions. In terms of the actual impact on cyber, something like 75%, we did a survey, and 75% of our members have had to change and modify their cyber programs in response to the pandemic. And that ties into Yao Seng's comments about managing risk, that you're going to need to manage risk differently now that we're adapting new working practices and new processes. Only about 3% said that digital banking needed adapting, which would suggest that most firms have got good digital solutions that were fit for purpose. And interestingly, 46% of those surveyed said that they would expect investment in cyber to grow post-COVID. So people are seeing, you know, that this new digital working practice and this new distributed perimeter is going to need more investment in order to keep it safe.
Thanks, Ray.
Just to chime in, I think on the topic of resilience and security, I think a lot of us now are working from home, and hence a lot of these network equipments are actually retail grade or consumer grade kind of equipment, unlike those equipment that we are used to working in office, right? Those are commercial grades, one, better configured, more sturdy, and there are backups in all these devices. Now, when we're working from home, where we're actually using our own unbranded equipment that's connecting back to office and doing very important work. So I think this is an area that probably in the long run we should think about, you know, upgrading our home equipment for the purpose of office working. Thanks.
Thanks, Yao Seng. David, anything to add on this one from your end?
Yeah, for sure. So I think both Yao Seng and Ray touched on a key point, which is as we're effectively changing our business context dramatically, not just in our organization, but across the whole value chain and out into your supply chain. Many organizations are now working from home where they've never worked from home before. And therefore, a number of procedures that you would normally follow need to change. I think this is a lot about human and process as a factor here. So one key point to recognize is that as different organizations have taken on measured risk, they've adjusted their control planes in order to continue running their businesses. have they looked at those changes holistically in their environment? Are they seeing it end to end? Do they have a view where if, you know, in 6 months' time, we've been running this for a long period now, they know all of the decisions that they've made and they know how to potentially adjust them, wind them back, remediate them, whatever else. So I think a key point here is actually making sure you've got a clear group who has almost visibility, panoptic visibility to all of the risk and control decisions that are being made across a technology environment, across an organization. So we don't have these left-hand, right-hand situations where we think we can rely on this control over here, but we didn't know that it had actually been weakened. So that's one key point from a practice standpoint. The second thing is that human element. The thing that's different to this situation versus others is we've got to recognize that our staff are working from home. In many cases, they have had children at home for prolonged periods. So, you know, mum and dad are working. They're also homeschooling. They're trying to set up their kids to go to school. Their kids are struggling with that. They're having difficulties ordering and procuring things for their home. They've got a number of distractions and stresses in the environment. At the same time that that's happening, I think every institution that I've talked to, we're busier than ever. Not just from a technology standpoint, but the business volumes. It's a very volatile environment at the moment. So our businesses are working harder than they've ever worked. And they have whilst organizations have been able to be quite productive, they're missing some of the office productivity they would generally have. And so it's putting a lot of pressure on them. I think as we think about the short-term success, hey, we managed to move to this environment, we need to think hard about sustainability of that environment and of the controls in that environment. The last thing I would say is vendors and third parties have also, you know, from a supply chain standpoint, had to adapt quickly and make a number of changes. And so you may be thinking about your reliance on a third party or a vendor. Are you aware of the changes that they've made to their risk posture and how that may affect your organization? So those are really three areas that I think where we've seen these events occur previously, it wasn't so majorly cross-sector. It wasn't for such a long period of time, and it wasn't affecting people on the level, emotionally, psychologically, you know, physically through exhaustion that we're seeing right now. And through that, where you've got manual processes, manual controls, that's where you're going to see human error creeping in as well. So those would be the things that I feel are really different here, is just this marathon that's been going on for so long.
Okay, thanks, David. And Flora, can I please ask you to share the results of the polling questions? So overwhelmingly, it seems that over half, for half of the respondents, ensuring safe and secure working from home environment for employees has really been the biggest challenge for firms over the last couple of months, followed by rolling out safety and security new digitization projects. So this corresponds very well to a number of points you've all been touching on. But Joe-Sang, perhaps question for you is really, so regulators in response to the pandemic have been quite flexible and forthcoming, generally speaking, in terms of providing firms with extensions of certain reportings, deadlines of certain regulatory reports or reg implementation projects, consultation deadlines, etc. But obviously less so on the cyber front, right? So for example, the MAS cyber hygiene notice went live basically in the middle of the summer throughout the pandemic. So what do regulators, given everything you've been seeing and everything you've been hearing today, so what do regulators really expect from firms in light of all this? You touched on upgrading equipment in the longer term, but anything you can share in terms of regulatory expectations for the firms you're regulating?
Yeah, I think on the cyber front, we have sort of intensified our monitoring of the financial institutions, especially the key ones. And we were pretty glad that actually our cyber hygiene notice came into force this year, after giving 1 year to the financial institutions to actually adjust their internal operations. So we were very glad that, you know, it came into force, and the financial institutions have to comply with the notice. So this is an area that I think we expect the financial institutions continue to enhance and bolster their cyber defense. The other area is on the technology risk management. We did a consultation last year on technology risk management guidelines and put out some of the new ideas that financial institutions have to be aware of. And I think it's very timely for us to incorporate some of these key learning points into the revised TRM guidelines. And we hope to be able to issue the guidelines by end of this year. Hopefully by then, I think the COVID situation will have been more under control, and so that people can start working on complying with the best practices espoused in the technology risk management guidelines.
Great.
Thank you.
Thanks, Joseng. Yeah, we responded to the TRM consultation as well, so very much looking forward to seeing the final version and incorporating some of the lessons learned from the last couple of months. So we've been talking a lot about the challenges that firms have been facing, but what are some of the best practices really that firms can adopt, right? For example, we have one question from the audience being like, is there any additional control measures that can be added to tackle insider risks as employees are working from home without a monitoring environment in the office? So perhaps, David, I'll start with you. So with staff working from home, you touched on that human element, etc. What are some of the best practices that in your view people can put in place to mitigate these?
Yeah, happy to talk through this. I mean, there's really 4 or 5 key areas which I'll try and cover very quickly. This has been something that we've been focused on within our organization, but also we've been having these dialogues with our clients and customers who are also very concerned about this. I'd really break it up into, the first part is the firm-wide response, and I touched on that need to document and navigate the risk and have some kind of end-to-end or centralized view of that. I think what's very important as people are adopting new technology is to recognize that you don't necessarily need to adopt everything of that. You can adopt components of it and help you to avoid risk rather than necessarily managing it. So that's something we've been very thoughtful about as we think about bringing on new collaboration tools or various other things to ensure we're only using the feature set and functionality that we need to as we do more in-depth analysis. So that's something to think about. The first point, just enabling safe remote working. We continue to, on a regular basis, remind our employees of cybersecurity best practices when they're working remotely, securing their home Wi-Fi, providing advice and guidance on that. An obvious but often forgotten one is only using company-approved communication tools, avoiding, electronic communications which aren't endorsed and verified by the firm. Never sending work documents to personal email accounts. So, a lot of pressure to say, hey, I need to send something home and print it so I can sign it, working with our teams on how to avoid needing to do that. And also not enabling remote printing when we need to. Those are some of the things that we've really focused on to help mitigate those insider threats. Lastly, just reminding and keeping our staff vigilant on personal device operating systems and applications, keeping them up to date with the latest versions. So it's kind of on the remote safe working. I'll touch on a couple of other things and then I'll let Ray and same comment as well. I think some things that are often forgotten is the need to maintain an awareness of your surroundings. You're at home, you may be working with a loved one who is actually working at a competing firm, making sure you're not sharing material non-public information with them or other confidential information. Super important. But then as people have moved out of a lockdown or a circuit breaker situation, they haven't returned to the office, you do have this risk of people taking liberties and saying, well, I'm just going to go down to a cafe and work or whatever else. So maintaining awareness, not conducting business in public spaces or over public Wi-Fi. Probably the most important one is this vigilance to following and knowing and following established procedures. This is especially important in any high-risk area. Things like changing account details, initiating payments, resetting passwords, and it doesn't just need to be business processes, it could be tech processes. Reminding staff of the need to follow those processes because those things are ripe for an attacker to go after and try and pretext and socially engineer you. Hey, my call's been forwarded. I'm not coming from my original number. You know, just call me back at this number because my office number is not working. Those are really good conditions where, you know, you've got tired, distracted, and exhausted payment staff, for example, who are dealing with some urgent payment request. It's come from an unknown number. They think they know the voice. They've got kids screaming in their ears. They may make that mistake of taking discretion. So really reminding your staff to stick to those established procedures. Very last one or two, ensuring knowledge of your response plans. And in that comes making sure you have a good understanding of authoritative sources of information. Because what we've seen is a number of misinformation campaigns that have played out both in the public sector and in the private sector, where threat actors are trying to leverage on some news that's come, pivot it and tweak it, and use it to induce people to do other things. So as much as possible, giving your staff a clear view of what those authoritative sources are, providing regular and transparent updates. And we've seen a number of governments, you know, Singapore is a good example of that, where they work very early on to be open and transparent with their dialogues and even sort of debunk rumors and myths that are spreading around. So I think that sort of culture and providing them inside your organization is very important. And then lastly, it seems obvious, but testing business continuity and not just waiting on the time when you want to test it, but saying, okay, let's look around the corner. We may be in a situation where key staff, sales, trading, people who have recorded lines, they're essentially in the office now, but what happens if they have to go home? Work through plans with that, test it with them, even in advance of needing to invoke those plans. So not just relying on an annual or a period process to test and validate business continuity, but also seeing upcoming events and working through how you take a heightened view of that and making sure that it's working effectively. Those are probably the 5 or 6 things that we feel are super important. I get that they're not deep cyber technical things, but you know, when you look at the actors that are targeting these situations, they're still targeting the human more than anything else, right? So it's really important we think about people, process, and technology in this response.
Great, thanks, David. And Ray, does that resonate with you? Anything else you'd like to add to that? Any best practices you've been seeing?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. It's a very comprehensive answer there from David. And really, it boils down to good old-fashioned risk management, that you're going to be looking at your business processes and how they've changed post-pandemic. And you're going to need to challenge the various assumptions that probably evolved over years in your firm, where you've basically managed risk on the assumption that people were going to be in your office environment, which you control, and you're now going to have to acknowledge that things are changing, both from a technical point of view. As Yao Seng mentioned earlier, people are going to be using consumer-grade electronics, for example, in their homes, rather than what you're used to having in the enterprise. And also the human element is super important. I mean, as David said, people are in a more difficult environment. They're more prone to interruption. It's going to be a bit more stressful for them, and you need to be cognizant of that and the interesting new risks that imposes. So you really, you know, think about things like your children are making a lot of noise, so you go out to Starbucks to work for a couple of hours, and how do you handle that kind of risk? Is that acceptable, and so on?
Okay. Hey, and then just a question from the audience for you, right, in relation to this. Like, while we're waiting for the TRM guidelines to find the renewed ones to be issued, are there any immediate critical controls, mitigants that the MAS expects or recommends institutions to put in place?
Sure. I'm an IT auditor by training, so I go by the audit principles. I personally feel that, especially during this period of time when a lot of us are working from home, things like segregation of duties, dual controls, 4 eyes checks, for example, are even more important. Certain processes that we are used to performing by a single person in office, we may want to consider breaking it up into different parts so that different parties can actually exercise the separation of duties better to perform the check and balance. And of course, I think since we are all connecting in from the internet, from our homes, And I think the multi-factor authentications is really, really going to be very important to secure our authentication, to secure our systems. So I think these are the key control principles. I think if we are able to do well, we probably can actually help to reduce the risk that we face working from home.
Interesting. I'll now take another couple of questions from the audience that people have been submitting. One is around what do you think the most valuable assets to protect are in light of the evolving cyber landscape nowadays? So the most valuable assets to protect, and do you believe we can fully protect them? Who wants to take that one?
Maybe I can start with a non-IT perspective. I think philosophically, working from home and not having the kind of face-to-face interactions with our fellow colleagues is an asset I feel that we may lose over time if this prolongs, stretched, and then we lose that connections and that kind of social cohesions within the office environment to be able to create better things, come up with better ideas, come up with better cybersecurity solutions, and be able to share cyber threat information more intimately and co-create solutions. So I think that is an asset that I fear that we may lose if the working from home kind of arrangements prolongs. Currently, I think we are all very efficient, and I claim that I can be very efficient working alone from home. My kids are all grown up, so I have my wife is busy at work as well, so nobody to disturb me. So I can be very efficient and effective working from home. But I think overall, that soft aspects of human connections may lose its effectiveness, and especially when you have new joiners coming to organizations, they need to feel the kind of environment of togetherness, and the kind of culture that we are going to impart to these new joiners is going to be very important. So I think this is one of the key assets that I think we may lose if we don't think hard and about it and how we want to resolve that. Thanks.
Okay. Thanks, Ray. You might want to add to what the role that FSISAC can play in terms of at least mimicking that human connection and keep the information sharing going.
Yeah, I mean, I think the human connection is tremendously important. I mean, everybody's seen that. For example, I was realizing this week that there's certain people that I'm used to seeing when I'm on business travel, that I would run into them in offsites or in conferences, and we would get a coffee together and have a chat. I've not spoken to these people for 6 months. And yet I don't need to talk to them every week, but on a 6-monthly basis, I definitely do. And I realize I have to actually go out and schedule those calls now and catch up with those people to touch base. So that's a huge change to your working practices. That there was a whole level of connectivity that you had that was happening on a sort of serendipitous basis, that you need to actually start to pursue those and actively engage with people on those. So the human element is super important. And in terms of protecting assets, I mean, you've obviously got two assets that have really changed here. One is your endpoint, which has moved out of the office and into new environments. So obviously your endpoint becomes endpoint controls are going to be one area you're going to be looking at very carefully, but the other is that human element, the people who are behind the keyboards. I'd also say from the FSISAC perspective, of course, sharing is really important. So in terms of combating cyber, it's very important that you are plugged into networks where you can share, that your cyber responders are able to share with the rest of the financial services community. So that's where we try to help. When the pandemic started, we kicked off the go live of Connect, which is our new secure chat platform, and we established chat rooms in there for members to share about the pandemic and also about other things that are going on as well. So do get plugged into local sharing groups or global sharing groups like FSISAC, and do network with your peers, because if you share best practices amongst yourselves, that you can benefit from other people's experiences.
Great, thanks, Ray. A question perhaps for Joe Sang from the audience, and please, dear audience, keep them coming. These are all great. So question is really, what do you think corporates can do to measure their cyber risk posture? Do they need to engage, for example, third-party independent opinion on cyber risk assessments? And what can these like external audit firms, etc., for example, play? Joe Sang, you were mentioning in your keynote that the MAS has been adopting a metrics-driven supervisory approach. Anything you would like to add to that in response to that question before I turn to Ray and David on this one?
Yeah, I think before we start measuring, I think we have to first establish what are the indicators that we want to take note of, and what are the sort of the service level or the outcome that we want to achieve. And certainly, I think it would be good if you can get a third party to do the measuring and assessments that will be more independent. But I think that not everybody has the resources to sort of engage a third party every time they want to do an assessment. So I think there's quite a lot of literature in the open, and then we can actually take reference from them and what are the key indicators that we want to measure. I think with regard to cybersecurity, I think the patching is, I can't stress the importance of patching, timeliness of patching of systems. So I think this is one area that we want to be very focused on and really ensure that high risk security vulnerabilities are patched very promptly. This is something that we can start with if we want to measure quickly, get a sense of how your security posture is. I think once your security systems are patched and say your antivirus programs are actually updated with the latest signature, I think that will be most important areas to start with. Thank you.
Thanks. David, Ray, anything you wanted to add to this question?
Yeah, I mean, cyber hygiene, you're going to need that fundamental layer of basic cyber hygiene, because it doesn't matter what intelligence you're getting about what threats are out there. If you don't have that fundamental layer of patching, endpoint protection in terms of antivirus, web filtering, secure authentication, if you don't have those basic building blocks, then your response to any kind of incidents and threats is going to be very limited, because you're going to have holes in your foundational layer there. So yeah, really stick to the fundamental cyber hygienes, and that's stuff that you've been doing for years, but it's absolutely critical.
Great. Thanks.
I just add to what you're saying, Ray was saying. Look, an independent assessment is extremely valuable. It doesn't matter how big or small you are as an organization. In addition to whatever internal assessment you may have through first line, second line, third lines of defense, we do think it's extremely valuable to have not an audit, but an open book, independent assessment with real technical subject matter experts in the area of cybersecurity. Work with them, collaborate with them. Like, it's not a pass or fail, it's an opportunity to inform your agenda, your roadmap, where you may have blind spots that, you may feel that you've got those risks well buttoned up, but they have the benefit of looking across sectors and cross sectors to understand how different organizations have done things and what types of challenges they've run into. So I think it's a really important part of an ongoing cyber risk management program to have the ability to do those independent assessments, for sure.
Thanks, David. Joe Sang, another question for you from the audience. In terms, for example, the HKMA, they've come up with a guideline to mitigate phishing attacks. So, for example, FIs are no longer, they cannot send any e-banking URL hyperlinks to their customers by emails and SMS, etc. Question is really, is the MAS thinking on doing something similar as well? Are you thinking along the same lines?
With regard to phishing, or in terms of advising the?
Yeah, revising the, so HKMA has come up with for example, with a specific guidelines on that front.
Yeah, so during the pandemic, we have actually issued quite a number of advisories, whether it's operational resilience related or cyber related. And certainly phishing is one of the areas that we have also sent out advisory on, asking the FIs to be more wary about the heightened COVID themes, phishing attacks, remind their employees to not click on links or respond to emails that they are not familiar with. So these advisories have been going out to the financial sectors. Yeah, and certainly, yes, I think phishing is an important area that we are actually monitoring, and our research and intelligence team within MES have also been doing our surveillance with regard to the cyber threat landscapes, and we do readily share all these current threats to the financial sector at large.
Great, thanks. Now, switching gears perhaps a little bit. So I'd like to spend the last 5 to 10 minutes at looking ahead. But before we do that, there was a question from the audience around around industry-wide business continuity, cyber business continuity exercises, right? So we know, for example, ABS is driving Project Raffles in Singapore. We have Project WISE here in Hong Kong. Our peer association, ASIFMA, has been running Quantum Dawn in the US, right? Like, is there anything that we have learned over the last couple of months that is important to help us better organize these industry-wide exercises going forward? Any shortfalls or blind spots that were perhaps previously not picked up in these exercises during scenario building and planning. I must say that actually the Hong Kong exercise, which was last held in November, the scenario was a pandemic, which looking back I find quite interesting, because that was the time of a lot of social unrest and protests in Hong Kong. So I guess everybody was assuming that the scenario would focus on that, but no, it was a pandemic. So that was an interesting choice here in Hong Kong late last year. But any views from the participants, from the panelists on looking forward at future exercises, anything we should tweak?
Yeah, I think maybe I can take a stab at it. I think the COVID pandemic has sort of challenged many of the assumptions that we have made in terms of our BCP planning. I think one aspect of it is really the length of the crisis. I was just talking to my colleagues this morning, and they were saying that, we better brace ourselves, because this is going to be a marathon instead of the sprints that we are very used to in managing crisis, right? It's like 1 week, 1 month, but this is going to drag on for 1 or 2 years at least. So I think that there is a need to actually relook at the scenario planning for business continuity management. And of course, and that will drive how we play out the exercises if we do conduct one. At this point in time, I think we will just have to capture all the lessons learned, because the situation is still morphing, and there are many, many valuable lessons that we can actually pick up from this crisis. And I don't expect that we will do a crisis exercise anytime within the next few months, because we are in the midst of crisis. But I think the learning points will be very, very useful going forward for our planning of the exercises. So another point that I thought I want to share is really that COVID has conjured a multidisciplinary crisis. As I mentioned earlier, is about health, it's about financial, and it's about operations. So I think no one can have all the solutions to all these different types of problems. And what I've seen is that greater collaborations in the industry to share the best practices in managing the pandemic, and cybersecurity is going to be very important. And we really need to crowdsource for solutions and better ways of doing things. And hence, I think that information sharing platforms like FSISAC and Series will play an ever important role in facilitating the information sharing in the industry. Thank you.
Thanks, Joseng. And perhaps one thing to add from my end is that, so as I was mentioning, ASIFMA, or sister association in the US, they've been running their exercise called Quantum Dawn for the US for many years, since 9/11. And last year, for the first time, they actually ran a global exercise, which I believe MAS was an observer, as well as many of the endorsers on the phone, or endorsers of this event today. And actually, one of the takeaways of that November 2019 Global Quantum Dawn exercise was the need, there is a gap in terms of a global communication sharing platform on a global basis, when amongst industry regulators, all the relevant stakeholders, when an event happens, right? So as a follow-up action, what we are doing under the GFMA and with ASIFMA is building really that global directory of all key stakeholders, firms, regulators, FMIs, keep that up to date and test that regularly to really, again, to help information sharing during an event. So totally agreed. We have we have only a couple of minutes left, so I would actually like to turn our attention now to some forward-looking thinking. And Flora, just to kick that off, can you please show the second polling question, which is around in post-COVID, if one day it will happen, we'll be in a post-COVID world. My organization will likely allow employees to work from home all the time, 75% of the time, 50% of the time, 25% of the time, or on a minimal basis. So while the audience is responding to that, perhaps from all the panelists, some thoughts on really like lessons learned, not only lessons learned, actually like opportunities and priorities beyond COVID-19, right? Looking ahead, any recommendation, thoughts you want to share with the audience? David, I see you nodding, so I'll start with you.
Yeah, I think the old saying goes, never waste a crisis, right? If you look at the amount of digital innovation and accelerated delivery of various programs that have happened over the last 6 months, it's probably that sort of cliched question: who is the biggest sort of driver of your digital disruption? Is it your CEO, your CTO, or COVID-19? I think a lot of organizations have gone through a digital disruption out of necessity rather than because they wanted to. But they probably have those plans in place anyway. So it's probably worthwhile understanding, well, what was it that allowed those organizations to accelerate in a safe and secure way? Was it a sense of shared purpose? What was it? And what worked well and what didn't? And I think different organizations will have that in pockets. So it's worth working across them to understand where that landed. I think the other important point, though, not to be the doomsdayer here, but that point I made earlier around documenting and navigating the risk associated with all the decisions you took. In 12 months post-COVID, let's hope it's in 12 months, the organizational memory is going to be short. And so it's important that people understand what they did tactically. Don't allow tactical to accidentally become strategic. Look back at all the risk and controls in your environment and make sure that you're driving those out to a sustainable place where you feel comfortable with it. So I think that's probably the other thing, is really making sure the timing around when you accept risk or you take it on, you actually time down that and look to review it frequently over the coming months and years.
Thanks, David. Ray, any thoughts from you on priorities?
Yeah, I think it's tremendously positive that people have been able to. I think Yao Seng said earlier that Microsoft was saying we had basically 2 years of digitization happened in 2 months. So there's been tremendous opportunity to bring forward digital agendas that would probably normally have met with reluctance. People are conservative and they don't want to change stuff that seems to be working. So there's been a tremendous opportunity there to experiment. And as David says, we really need to be sure that looking back, we actually understand what we changed and why, and that we're able to adjust our risk management accordingly and to consider that.
Great, thanks. Flora, can you perhaps share the results of the polling question, please?
Hey, Lawrence, one more thing to add here, which I think is super important, which I neglected to mention. It's really around manual versus automated controls. Look, we know that actors will target human vulnerability and manual process every day of the week because there's discretion, right? As much as possible, when you think about those processes that are high risk, the value bearing, they're money moving, those types of processes, if we can get to a place where the controls are automated and preventative, where these processes are straight through, we're taking away the ability for those social engineering points. So a lot of that has happened. You know, a lot of good work has happened over the last 3-6 months. It's just keep the foot to the pedal on that and really make sure that organizations continue to drive that out, because that's the real opportunity from a cyber standpoint, coming out of this as well.
Thanks, David. I'm just looking at the polling results. So it seems that, yeah, around 40% of the attendees thinks that for their organization, people will be allowed generally to work from home 50% of the time. Only 6% allowed all the time, which is actually not little, or on a minimal basis, 23%. And perhaps as a couple of follow-up questions from the audience that are in that relate to that is that, for example, I think it was Josang, you were started in your opening remarks. You were saying that there will be a mix, right, between working from home and in the office. And so with that traditional thinking of work and home, with a firewall defining these, this will be incompatible with the new normal, right? Do your organizations deploy zero trust security models, and do regulatory security guidances allow for such zero trust frameworks? Anyone wants to take that one from the audience? Not really. Okay. Another food for thought offline then. Another question really in relation to that is that in your view, are there any roles that will not be able to or should not be allowed to work from home in the longer term? Josang, perhaps can I throw that one to you first?
Yeah, sure. I think there is no hard and fast rule on that. I think some institutions have come to MAS to say that, okay, do you allow trading to be done from home? Do you allow fund transfers to be performed from home and things like that? And I think that the answer to this is like really how ready is your organization and what kind of controls your organization currently have to actually reduce the risk. And I think there's no one size fits all kind of approach, depending on your capabilities and your monitoring system currently that you have. You can allow the majority of things to be work from home if the equipment permits you. So I think there's no hard and fast rule, but I think you have to assess whether as an organization you are ready to support or be able to control that kind of sensitive functions or transactions to be carried out from home. Yeah, I think each institution will know best and have to do the assessment.
Thanks. Ray, David.
Spoken like a true auditor there, I thought, that it really depends what controls you've got in place, but that's really nice that they're open to discuss with you what controls you've got in any particular scenario.
Thanks, Ray. David, any final words from you before we bring the event to a close, because we're running out of time?
No, thank you. That's fine.
Okay, great. So we came to the end of our virtual event. There was a couple of questions from the audience that we were not able to cover, but thanks everyone for submitting these. So thanks Josang, Ray, and David for sharing your insights with us today. It's very much appreciated. Thanks to the audience for attending. Over the next couple of days, we will be sending an email with a link to the recording of the session. So feel free to share these with your relevant contacts. We'll also be uploading that to the ASIFMA website. At ASIFMA, we have an agenda of a series of virtual events. So our next one is on Korean capital markets analysis, an overview and investment opportunities. We're doing that in collaboration with COFIA, and it will be held on Thursday, 22nd of October, so coming up very soon, at 4 p.m. Korean time, at 3 p.m. Hong Kong time. So you can reserve your spot by scanning the QR code that you're seeing on the screen right now. So we hope to see many of you there. I hope you enjoyed the session today. Thanks again. People in Hong Kong, stay dry and stay safe today with the T8, and everybody have a great day. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.